I was standing outside, the Michigan winter wind cutting into my skin, when my banking app showed a zero balance. $300,000. The money I sold my entire machine shop for just to save my wife's legs was gone. I called my son. He let out a soft laugh and said, "Thanks, Dad." On the other end of the line, my wife's coughing came in broken bursts, and in that moment I understood the cruelest paradox of all. The one who destroyed our last hope was the very child I had raised with my own hands. But before I go on, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. Just knowing someone is out there, listening, is enough for me to keep telling this story. Now, let me take you back to that moment. I didn't stand there long. It wasn't the cold that made me shake. It was the emptiness in my head as I closed the banking app, opened it again, then closed it once more. The number didn't change. I knew I hadn't misread it. I've lived long enough to understand that when something disappears, it doesn't come back just because you look again. I got into the car. The old engine started smoothly familiar, as if it had no idea what had just happened. I drove toward Tyler's apartment. The road was iced over. The tires slipped slightly at a few turns. I didn't turn on the radio. I needed to hear my own thoughts, even though they were scattered and heavy. On the way, I called him again. The phone rang for a long time. Then my son's voice came on, clear, relaxed. I asked him directly. No detours. No softening the words. He went quiet for a few seconds, then spoke like he was explaining something ordinary, that he had used the money, that it was a business decision, that I didn't need to worry so much. I didn't yell. I never was the shouting type. I only asked him one question. "Do you know what that money was for?" He sighed, like I had asked something foolish. He said he knew. He said he remembered, and then he laughed. Not loud, just a short laugh. Enough for me to understand he didn't think he'd done anything wrong. By the time I arrived, it was already dark. The apartment lights were on, the large windows facing the parking lot. I knocked. Tyler opened the door, wearing an expensive jacket carrying a scent of unfamiliar cologne. He looked me up and down, his eyes resting on my worn shoes for a beat too long. I stepped inside. The apartment had been newly furnished. Everything, shiny, polished. On the table was an open laptop. Charts, figures, projections. He pointed to a chair, told me to sit, as if I were a guest. I asked again about the money. He didn't dodge it. He said he had transferred all of it to upgrade the portfolio. He said it was a rare opportunity. He said if I understood the market, I wouldn't be standing there with that look on my face. Then he added lightly, "Margaret will be fine. Mom's used to enduring things." That sentence silenced the room. I looked at him. I waited for some sign, anything, that he would stop, that he would realize he had crossed a line. But there was nothing. Only the cold confidence of someone who believes he is always right. Chloe walked out from the bedroom, perfectly dressed, hair flawless. She greeted me politely, but from a distance. Then she spoke like she was reading a prepared announcement. They were moving to Florida, a new villa, a housewarming party this weekend. And oh, the guest list was already finalized. I asked what any of that had to do with me. She smiled and explained slowly, each word carefully chosen, that it was a party for people of the same level, that my and Margaret's presence right now would be inappropriate. She didn't say more. She didn't need to. I stood up. No one stopped me. Tyler turned back to his computer screen. Chloe adjusted the bracelet on her wrist. The room returned to its rhythm, as if I had never walked in at all. Outside, the wind was stronger. I sat in the car, my hands on the steering wheel, but I didn't start it right away. My phone vibrated. It was Margaret. I put her on speaker. She asked if I had talked to our son. I said yes. She coughed, long and exhausted. I heard every strained breath, as if it were counting down to something neither of us wanted to name. She said it was okay. She said we would find another way. She told me not to make a big deal out of it. I stared into the darkness ahead where the snow was starting to fall thicker. And in that moment I realized our last hope had been taken, not by a stranger, but by the one person I had never believed could do this to us. I drove home. The old house was quiet, the hallway light dim. I helped Margaret lie down, adjusted the blanket. She slept restlessly. I sat at the kitchen table, reopening old documents. Accounts, signatures, decisions I had signed with blind faith. Believing family was the safest place of all. That night I didn't sleep, not because of burning anger, but because one question kept repeating, steady and cold. If even my own son could break every boundary, how much longer could I remain silent? The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Not because I'd come up with some grand plan, but because I couldn't sleep the way I used to anymore. When trust is drained dry, sleep goes with it. I made coffee and sat across from Margaret. She ate slowly, her hand trembling slightly as she held the spoon. I watched every small movement and understood more clearly than ever what I had staked my entire life on. After she went back to the bedroom to rest, I returned to the kitchen table. The bottom drawer held old papers I rarely opened. I used to think they were just memories of a working man's life. That day they felt more like evidence of a long chain of wrong choices, stretching back years. The emergency account had been opened when Tyler was still in high school. Back then my thinking was simple. If something ever happened to me, the boy wouldn't be left alone. I put his name on it alongside mine, not because I had to, but because I trusted him. I remember the day I signed the papers. My hands were stained with machine oil. My signature leaned slightly to the side. I didn't read the fine print carefully. I never imagined that a kid who used to wait for me outside the shop late at night would one day treat that account like his personal money. I went through each statement. Small transfers started showing up years ago. Scattered, uneven. Each time just small enough for me to let it slide. Rent money, car repairs, money to turn things around. I saw them, but I didn't ask. I had grown used to covering for my son, as if it were an obligation with no end date. Memories came back out of order. Long winter night shifts, my hands stiff from cold and grease, my worn jacket, and Tyler's new one, hanging neatly in the closet. I remember thinking, at least he won't have to live like I did. I'd succeeded in that. I just hadn't counted the cost. Around noon, a letter arrived. Not handwritten, an official notice printed cleanly without emotion. About an overdue loan. About the possibility of asset seizure if there was no timely response. The name signed at the bottom wasn't mine. It wasn't Tyler's either. It was a signature claimed to be Margaret's. I held that paper for a long time. I know my wife's signature. I've seen it for 40 years. This one looked similar, but it wasn't hers. It lacked her familiar hesitation, the slight tremble at the end of the stroke. I sat down. For the first time, I felt something that could no longer be ignored. I called Tyler. This time, he didn't answer. I called Chloe. She picked up. Her voice was still gentle. I asked about the loan. She said I must be mistaken. She said everything had been taken care of. When I mentioned Margaret's signature, she went silent. Then, she suggested I should get some rest, because lately I'd been a bit confused. I ended the call. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. One thing was suddenly clear to me. This wasn't a moment of impulsive behavior from a son. This was a lifestyle, a way of living built on draining whatever was left of others, and calling it success. That afternoon I drove slowly around the old neighborhood, rows of similar houses, peeling paint, slightly sagging porches. This was where I fixed neighbors' cars in exchange for dinner, where Margaret once planted flowers by the front door. I looked at my house and wondered, when did it become collateral for a life of luxury I had never even stepped into? When night fell, I sat alone in the garage. The smell of metal and engine oil was still there, even though the shop was gone. And I realized there's a clear difference between pain and awakening. Pain knocks you down. Awakening forces you to stand up, even when your legs are still shaking. I took out an old notebook. I began writing down everything I could remember. Dates, amounts, phone calls, seemingly harmless words. I didn't call it revenge. I called it facing the truth. If I stayed silent any longer, Margaret would be the next one to pay the price. And possibly the last. When Margaret woke up, she asked what I was doing. I told her I was organizing some old matters. She looked at me longer than usual. She didn't ask more. Sometimes, silence is the only way to keep steady. That night, I closed the notebook. I knew I had crossed another line. I was no longer just a father hoping his son would stop on his own. I was still his father. But I was also Margaret's husband. And this time, I would not allow anyone to mistake my patience for weakness. I didn't tell Margaret what I was doing. Not because I wanted to hide it from her, but because I needed her to have some peace. Each wave of pain she carried was already heavy enough. I only told her I'd be going out a few mornings, taking care of some old matters. She nodded, held my hand. Her eyes still trusted me the way they always had. That trust made me move slower, more carefully. The first person I went to was Frank. We'd worked the same neighborhood once, fixing cars for neighbors. Later on, Frank moved into investigations for a financial insurance firm. I didn't need a long explanation. I just handed him the statements, the loan notices, and the signature that wasn't Margaret's. Frank looked at everything closely. He didn't say much. He only told me to bring anything else that might be connected. From that day on, my life split into two rhythms. During the day, I was still the tired old father, forgetful, slow. I replied to messages late. I spoke in fragments. I let Tyler believe I had accepted what was done. I even asked him to help with a few small things, sign a couple of papers. I did just enough to make him think I was weakening. At night, I sat with Frank. We traced every transfer, every invoice. The money didn't wander the way they thought it did. It moved straight from the emergency account to payments in Florida. Deposits, furniture, service fees. The figures lined up neatly, cold and precise. Frank told me evidence doesn't need to be loud. It only needs to be accurate. Some days Tyler came by the house. He brought fruit, a few polite questions. He told me I should rest more. He asked if I remembered signing certain papers. I nodded, confused. I kept a small recorder in my jacket pocket, not to trap him into saying anything extreme, but to capture the calm disregard in his voice. He wasn't careful. He thought I couldn't keep up anymore. Once he said everything would eventually be taken care of, that I should trust him, that Margaret didn't need to worry too much. I didn't respond. I just coughed lightly, asked him to repeat a few things. He did. Slower, clearer. Frank told me. Sometimes the truth reveals itself when people believe no one is sharp enough left to hear it. At the same time, Frank introduced me to a lawyer. We met in a small office, nothing flashy. I brought my notebook, the copies, the selected recordings. The lawyer listened, asked questions, took notes. He explained a concept I had never considered before. Financial abuse of an elderly person. He said the law doesn't need emotion. It needs timelines, signatures, intent. I went home with a list of things to do. Not long, but heavy. I had to keep playing the tired father a little longer. I had to let Tyler and Chloe believe they were in control. I had to stay patient. Even as each day meant more pain for Margaret, Chloe started calling me more often. She asked if I was preparing for the move. She suggested I sell a few old things. She said Florida was warm, good for health. I listened. I agreed. I even asked her to send me a few bills so I could look them over. She sent them, without hesitation. Maybe she believed I wasn't clear-minded enough to understand them. One afternoon I pretended to faint lightly in the kitchen. Nothing serious. Just enough to scare Tyler. He rushed over, called for help, raised his voice. I came around quickly, apologized for the trouble. I saw something in his eyes. Something like relief. He thought I was declining faster than expected. I let him believe that. Frank reminded me not to rush. Every piece had to be in the right place. We matched the periods when Margaret's pain worsened with the larger expenses. They aligned. We had the forged signature verified by a specialist. Clear, solid. Slowly it all formed a picture that couldn't be denied. There were nights I questioned myself. I was Tyler's father. I had taught him how to stand upright, and now I was quietly building a legal wall against my own son. That question followed me through many nights, but every morning when I saw Margaret struggle to get up, I knew I had no other choice. The day the lawyer said, "We have enough," I didn't feel relieved. I felt calm, a calm very different from the silence before. Not the silence of endurance, but the silence of preparation. I knew the hardest part was still ahead, but this time, I wasn't walking into it with empty hands. We flew to Florida on a bright, sunlit morning. I didn't tell Margaret the full plan. I only said there was a necessary meeting, that I wanted her by my side. She nodded. She was used to me not saying much, and I knew she felt this wasn't an ordinary trip. The villa sat in a quiet area, tall gates, a wide driveway. Cars lined up across the front lawn. People laughing, raising glasses, shaking hands. Faces I'd never seen before. But the eyes were familiar, confident, rushed, always searching for the next advantage. I pushed Margaret's wheelchair slowly forward. At first, no one noticed us. We were just two old people who had wandered into a party not meant for us. Tyler spotted us from a distance. He froze. I could see the calculation pass through his face. Then he walked over quickly, speaking in a low voice, saying this wasn't a good time. I told him I was just there to congratulate him. I said I wouldn't stay long. My tone was calm, careful enough not to draw attention. He hesitated, then stepped aside. He still believed I wouldn't do anything else. Chloe appeared right after, that familiar smile, slightly tight. She bent down to speak to Margaret, asked about her health. I listened, but I didn't interrupt. I watched the way she positioned herself between us and the crowd, like she was blocking out an unwanted detail from her perfect picture. When all the guests had gathered, Tyler stepped onto a small platform in the center of the hall. He talked about his journey, his vision, his strategic partners. People applauded. I listened to every word, not because I believed them, but because I knew those words were about to be placed next to a very different truth. When it came time for the toast, I raised my hand. Not high, just enough for the host to see. I asked for a few minutes. Tyler turned toward me, a warning in his eyes. I nodded back, as if to reassure him. I pushed Margaret's wheelchair slightly forward. The lights shifted toward us. The room grew quieter. I didn't speak for long. I said I was Tyler's father. I said I was proud that my son had come so far. I said I only wanted to share a few images, so everyone could better understand the foundation of our family. I gave a signal. The screen behind me lit up. It wasn't what they expected. No growth charts. No yachts. Just Margaret's swollen legs photographed in a clinic room. Then medical bills. Then furniture payments, designer bags, service fees, placed side by side. Matching dates. The room didn't erupt. It sank, in the most uncomfortable way. I heard whispers. Tyler stepped forward, said there had been a misunderstanding. I didn't argue. I played the recording. Tyler's voice filled the hall, clear, calm, talking about how the money should be used more efficiently. I didn't add a word. I let the silence do its work. Chloe stood still. Her smile vanished. A man in the crowd set his glass down. Another leaned over to whisper a question. I saw quiet nods. Avoiding eyes. This wasn't an explosion. This was a retreat. Slow, piece by piece. I spoke one last sentence. I said I hadn't come to cause a scene. I came to congratulate my son, and to protect my wife. I said everything else would be handled the proper way. I turned off the screen. I stepped back. No one applauded, but many people walked outside, took calls, spoke in hushed voices. Tyler stood frozen. For the first time, I saw him without words. Chloe grabbed his arm, whispered something quickly. I didn't hear it. I didn't need to. We left before the party ended. Outside, the air was warmer than Michigan, but I still felt cold. I pushed the wheelchair down the long path. Margaret held my hand. She didn't ask anything. She just squeezed gently, her way of saying she understood. In the car, my phone buzzed with messages. Not apologies, questions, requests to talk privately. I didn't respond. I knew from that moment on, the story was no longer in Tyler's hands. On the drive back to the hotel, I watched the lines of lights stretch ahead. I didn't feel satisfied, just a little lighter. Not because everything had been exposed, but because I had stopped pretending. I had stepped into the light with my truth. No shouting, no breaking things. That night I sat beside Margaret. She fell asleep early. I opened the window, listening to the distant sounds of the resort city. I knew tomorrow would bring more calls, more steps to take. But in that moment I allowed myself to sit still. I had done what needed to be done. The rest, I left to time and the law, slow, steady, and certain. After that evening, things moved more slowly than I expected. But they were never chaotic. There were no loud confrontations, just official letters, brief phone calls, quiet meetings behind closed doors. I returned to Michigan, with Margaret carrying a deep fatigue, but no longer that hollow emptiness I had felt before. The lawyer called a few days later. He said the parties involved had begun protecting themselves. Partners who had smiled at that Florida party quietly withdrew their names. Some sent emails confirming they were no longer involved. I didn't feel joy. I simply noted it. I've lived long enough to know. When light shines in many things, retreat on their own. The legal process wasn't fast, but it was clear. Accounts were temporarily frozen. Loan records were reviewed. Margaret's signature was officially confirmed as invalid. I didn't have to speak much. I just provided what I had, in the right order, at the right time. The rest was no longer mine to carry. In the meantime, Margaret's surgery was rescheduled. The doctor said there was still a chance, if it wasn't delayed again. I sat in the waiting room, listening to the steady ticking of the clock. I thought about the old machine shop, about the money that had disappeared, and then quietly found its way back. Not like a miracle, but like a circle finally closing after months of disorder. On the day the court reached its decision, I didn't go. The lawyer called me that afternoon. He said the assets involved had been used to restore the original amount, along with compensation. He said Tyler and Chloe were being held responsible for what they had signed and what they had said. He paused for a moment, then said, "You handled this the right way." I hung up and sat still for a long time. I didn't feel victory. I felt a weight being set down. I thought about Tyler. I didn't call him. I didn't wait for a call either. Some relationships don't return to what they were, and accepting that is sometimes the final step of growing up. Margaret's surgery took place on a quiet morning. I sat in the hallway, hands on my knees, back straight. When the doctor came out and nodded, I didn't speak. I just let out a breath, one I had been holding for months. The days that followed moved slowly. Margaret practiced walking one small step at a time, first standing, then a few steps with support. I stayed beside her, never rushing. Each step required a new kind of patience. I learned how to wait again, not in helplessness, but in grounded hope. One morning, sunlight filled the living room. Margaret took a few steps without holding my hand. She turned back toward me and smiled softly. Not a big smile, just one that told me everything had been worth it. I didn't say anything. I just stood there and witnessed it. A few weeks later, I signed papers to establish a small fund. Nothing large, nothing flashy. Its purpose was simple: to support older people facing financial abuse within their own families. I don't tell my story there. I just wanted to create a place where others wouldn't have to start from nothing, the way I once did. Life slowly returned to its old rhythm. I fixed a few things around the house. I replanted the flower bed out front. Margaret sat nearby, offering her familiar comments. We didn't talk much about the past, not because we forgot, but because we had placed it where it belonged. Some evenings I think about Tyler, about the years behind us, about my choices and his. I don't hold resentment. I don't make excuses either. I've accepted that some lessons can't be taught with words or endless patience. Some boundaries are only respected once they are clearly drawn. If there's one thing I want to say, it's this: forgiveness is a personal choice, but allowing harm disguised as family loyalty to keep destroying your life, that isn't virtue. I am his father, and the final lesson I leave behind is not silence, but responsibility. That morning, Margaret and I sat on the porch with our coffee. The Michigan air was lightly cold. She placed her hand over mine. I looked out at the familiar road, listened to cars passing by. Everything felt ordinary again, and this time, that ordinary life felt fuller than any distant luxury I had ever seen. If you stayed with me until the end of this story, thank you for listening. If it gave you something to think about, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it so stories like this can reach more people. The lesson I take from it is simple. Family is a place for love, not a place to endure in silence. Respect, boundaries, and responsibility matter just as much as blood. When you protect your dignity, you are also protecting the people you love. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next story.